Hello, thanks everybody. It sounds like French is occupying the room next door. Somebody gave him a microphone on a break, and should have known that was a mistake. So I'm sure we'll have a few more people coming into the session. Pleased to welcome Annu Warikoo, Senior Vice President, Enterprise Risk Management at Wells Fargo. The discussion topic today is building a scalable, resilient ERM framework from startup to listed company. Annu is an accomplished enterprise risk manager with over 25 years of experience in the financial services industry. She's got an extensive experience in management of large-scale risk programs as well. Annu is an ASACA-certified information technology risk management professional, experienced in leading multi-phase, multi-platform projects within global teams in financial firms. Her areas of expertise are technology risk, business continuity, disaster recovery, regulatory response for technology, and business process operationalization of the enterprise. Her current role is to lead the relationship management and communications for the Enterprise Risk Appetite Program at Wells Fargo. In her previous role as the head of enterprise risk at NASDAQ, Annu was responsible for setting the direction for the enterprise risk management function globally. She was also responsible for global leadership of the business continuity, security insurance, BY's GRC system governance, and Sarbanes-Oxley programs for their organization as well. So it was my pleasure to announce Annu, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ryan. So good afternoon. Thank you for coming here. I thought, when I signed up for this, it was an expert talk, so I thought we would be in a small room, we would have a talk, we would have some Q&A, and here we are. So I just wanted to start with saying that everything I say is my opinion, and these are not the opinions of Wells Fargo Bank or indeed of any other company that I have worked at. So during this talk, we're going to look at how an ERM framework can be effective at different phases of a company's life cycle. So effective doesn't always mean formal. I think for an ERM framework to be effective, it has to be scaled to the size of the company. So I'm going to cover enterprise risk definition, speak about phases of company maturity, the different stakeholders in each phase, and risk management expectations. So that is just sort of level setting that I will try to go through pretty quickly. And then I have a couple of case studies that I would like to spend time on, and I think you hopefully will find interesting. So before I start, I'd like to do a quick survey of the room. So is there anybody in the room who works for a company that has less than 1,000 people? Great, awesome. How about 1,000 to 5,000 people? Great. How about 5 to 25,000 people? Good. So, as I was going through the conference in the last day and a half, I really felt that maybe I just kept talking to people at other banks. I don't know. It just felt like I was talking to people that worked at very large companies. So I'm glad to see people here from smaller companies. And I think it's useful to think about your company, where it's at in the maturity life cycle, and what level of formality of enterprise risk management is needed to increase resilience. So what is enterprise risk management? One of the important points of enterprise risk management is that it's a fairly new and still evolving discipline. So even at this conference, every time I introduced myself, I met somebody new, and I said, I work in enterprise risk management, the next question they would ask is, well, which risk type do you focus on? And the answer is I focus, or the department focuses on all risk types for all business areas. And this graphic kind of illustrates that the one thing that you want to have in enterprise risk management is to have the ability to reflect your business in such a way that lets management and board take action. So you need to make sure that the risk information is complete. It covers all risk areas, covers all business areas. And what enterprise risk management generally does is put in a process and methodology in place so that you can identify risks across the board and have a methodology and metrics to measure and report it to the board. So in a large enterprise, who is usually in charge of enterprise risk management? It's generally a centralized department whose main function is doing this program definition. But you have to be careful that the enterprise risk management function doesn't devolve into just a risk data aggregation function, but is really more of like an Uber or second line of defense function over the other risk types. So sometimes the risk with doing that is that you're just talking in enterprise risk to the other risk types, and you're not really communicating or have a line of sight to the lines of business. So the important thing that enterprise risk has to maintain is not only have the ability and communication and processes to work with all the risk types, but also be able to communicate and gather information from the business areas. And lastly, many times, not always, but many times, internal audit as the third line of defense also leverages the ERM framework to do their work, their audit planning, et cetera. So my thesis is that the tone for enterprise risk management is set at the very beginning, when the firm starts, and it evolves through the maturity life cycle. So I'm differentiating the company phases using two criteria. What are the goals of the company, and what is the financial condition of the company? In the startup phase, a company's goal is to figure out what is the product, are there customers for it, and are they going to pay money for it? In the growth phase, the goal is to simultaneously build a customer base and attract venture capitalists. And so what does venture capital look at? They look at the investment thesis. They look at the product. They figure out, is it a new product? Is it a disruptor in the market? Are there patents? What is the pedigree of the current investors? And attracting investors that could also benefit from your product is sometimes a goal of the company. So once you are going through that growth phase and you start to get to the pre-IPO phase, the goal at that time is to figure out, is the company going to be profitable enough that it's worth to be getting ready to be listed? And then, of course, once you are listed, the goal is to make sure that there is a return on investment to stakeholders. So who are the stakeholders in each of these phases? One of the common things that we see is there's two stakeholders that are common in every phase of the life cycle, and they are, as you may guess, the customers and the employees. So the risk also changes throughout the phase, given the different stakeholders and the different expectations. So in the startup phase, the stakeholders, which are the founders, the customers, and the employees, their expectation is just to grow the company. But once the company is in the growth phase, then you are looking for that stickiness. You're looking for that traction. You have more than just customers and employees. You have to consider your competitors. You may have suppliers. And then once you're in the pre-IPO phase, and I'm going to go to the next page because this is really interesting point here. In the pre-IPO, actually no, I'm going to go back to the prior page. It's easier to see this. The stakeholders and the risks or the expectations in the pre-IPO phase are very different, because that's the point at which you are looking at regulatory expectations and also expectations from the exchange. If you really want to be listed, And you'll see this as a common theme in my presentation because I worked at NASDAQ before this. This is something that I saw. You are also trying to fulfill the expectation of the exchange because they sometimes will have more sort of operational expectations than a regulator would express. So many times, working with the exchange before you get listed is actually the point at which you start building up your risk management function. So during all these phases, many companies are just sort of doing risk management in a very organic way, in a very informal way. But when you start, you really are looking at liquidity risk, right? You want to make sure you have the funding to support your business. But a key point for startups is the key person risk, right? Sometimes the startup hopefully does not depend on just one person who holds the patent, but there are key person risks that are very crucial in the startup phase. In the growth phase, you're depending on those employees to build up your systems or your product if you're a manufacturer, and you have retention risk. You want to make sure that those people stay with you so that you can grow the company. And then as you get into the pre-IPO phase, you are now trying to build in processes so that you can meet the expectations of the regulators and the regulation. And that's where operational risk and market risk comes in. And the idea is that any of those risks could be irrelevant if you have conduct risk or reputational risk. And of course, once you're listed, then you have to be worried about all the risk types. So one more point here before I go into the case study. So once you are listed, there are significant shareholder expectations. But the big thing, and you'll see this in the case studies, is if you haven't spent time throughout the growth period to bake in risk management and controls in each phase, then once you are listed, it is so hard to sort of retrofit and change your processes, change your company culture so that you have the proper risk management and controls in place. So I'm going to go into my first case study, which is Snapchat, or the company is Snap. So I'm going to pause here, and with a show of hands, how many people know what Snapchat is? A good number, okay. I myself had to actually sort of do a little research by talking to my teenage children on what Snapchat was. So Snapchat went public in 2016, and earlier in 2016, I was at NASDAQ, and in that era, there were very few IPOs. So it was something that everybody looked at, especially because you can see the time period from company inception to IPO is very short, and not many companies go from start to finish in such a short time. So how did they do it? So number one, they did have issues and they made mistakes like many companies do, but they learned from their mistakes. They did not repeat them. And when they had a mistake, they also put in controls to avoid those mistakes again. So let me talk a little bit to the timeline here. So the company gets founded, there's 2 founding members, and they're looking for investors. And this gentleman, Jeremy Liu, from Venture Partners, invested a good chunk of money. But they signed a contract which gave this person first right of refusal to every investor after that. And another investor, when they saw that this person had right of refusal, backed out. So these people lost money like right away. Within weeks, they had somebody giving them money, but then there was more money that was coming in that they lost. And they realized that they had contract risk on their hands. Around the same time, a third collaborator filed a lawsuit, which is very common with these startups, and said basically that he also owned shares. Well, they owed him a share in the company because he also had collaborated on the idea. So they had a legal risk. So it took them about a year to get through these issues, get out of this contract, and settle the lawsuit. But from that point onwards, what you see about Snapchat is just progress in the right direction, continuous investment of infusion of investment, and also not really any negative media information, which is going to be very different from the next case study we look at. The control they put in place was they restated the company charter, and the founders maintained super voting rights over and above any common shareholders. And they went public at $24 billion valuation. This is for a company that all it does is let you share photographs that get deleted in 24 hours, and also provides a marketing channel for a lot of companies like CNN, New York Times, and even NASA has something called the Snap Channel. So this is a success story of a company that probably had very informal enterprise risk management, probably did not have a department called enterprise risk management, but they did all the right things. They were dealing with a bunch of different risk types, and they were putting in controls as issues were arising out of those risks. So going to the next case study, Uber. So I don't really have to take a poll to find out how many people know Uber. So I actually almost don't even have to go through the timeline of Uber's issues, because in the last 2 to 3 years, there hasn't been a month that has gone by that there hasn't been some negative issue about Uber in the news. However, as a consumer, it is a pretty successful product, right? But it's very hard to imagine if this company can ever go public because of all the reputation issues that they have faced. And not just that, it has had legal issues, it has had employee issues, municipalities have sued it, other people have sued it for copyright infringement. And finally, it seemed like last year, Uber turned a corner when they hired a new CEO. And it feels to me that they actually put in some kind of enterprise risk management playbook in place. Because I think it was last month or 2 months back, when they had a really unfortunate incident with their self-driving autonomous cars, they immediately put in a crisis plan in place. They stopped the pilot in Phoenix, and they issued statements around what they were going to do to try to fix the problems in its research before they went back. One of the things I want to do is, there's a great article that I happened to read just last week in The New Yorker about the CEO of Uber. And the title is Taking the Wheel. So I'm just going to read an excerpt from a speech that he made to his employees last year. This is before the horrible incident in Phoenix. And what he says is, the company brought me on board because of a lot of things that happened in the past. He said, we were probably trading off doing the right thing for growth and thinking about competition maybe a bit too aggressively, and some of those things were mistakes. He didn't need to list the mistakes, many of which had been widely publicized. Mistakes themselves are not a bad thing, he went on. The question is, do you learn from those mistakes? 2017 has been a really tough year, but this is going to result in us being a better company. So when I read this, like it's on the first page of this article, and it was almost like this person had seen my presentation because this happened, this article came out in April. And like truly that is the thesis of enterprise risk management or good management is learning from your mistakes and putting in lessons learned and controls in place to go forward from there. I'm going to go over one more case study, and then I'm going to pause for Q&A. So my last case study is Sony. So Sony is not a new company. It's a listed company. It's been around for many years. It's in all countries in the world. It has all kinds of products. And what happened at Sony? So this was an incident that happened in 2014. I don't know if any of you remember this, but it was November 2014, and it was Monday before Thanksgiving. Why is this important? Because half of business America is on holiday on Monday before Thanksgiving. And early morning in the offices in LA, green dancing skeletons, I love the green dancing skeleton aspect of this story, appeared on desktops, said, haha, we got you, and shut down a lot. It's not clear whether all desktops were shut down, but a lot of desktops in the office. And basically, nobody could do any work from that point onwards. So since it was Monday before Thanksgiving, not really much happened. All these people couldn't do their emails, so they just were like using their phones to do whatever work they do in Sony Pictures Entertainment. And within a couple of hours, it was in the media that Sony Pictures Entertainment had been hacked. Within a day or so, sensitive information such as emails that the CEO had been exchanging with people outside the company and people inside the company with derogatory information about major clients like movie stars and the president were leaked in file sharing sites. The next thing that was shared on those sites was employee personal information, including medical records. The next thing that was shared was employee compensation information of senior executives. And the last straw was intellectual property. So 2 new movies that were coming out were out in the public domain. Throughout all of this, Sony management, whatever they were doing, they were just scrambling. And it was mid-December before the CEO of Sony held a town hall with all the employees and basically said that the incident had been reported to the FBI, and they were working, they were doing their best to find out what the issue was. Within hours of that very weak statement from the CEO, a large class action lawsuit was filed by employees, ex-employees, who were very annoyed that their personal information had been leaked. So what do you sort of learn from this incident at Sony? Oh, and there are a couple of other things here. I think this was interesting that Sony had to set aside $15 million to deal with the ongoing damages. So there was a lot of discussion in a couple of other sessions today about how do you price the value of GRC? So there's tons of information like this out on the web of companies who you evidently had not very good risk management processes, couldn't figure out information fast enough, and then had to spend millions of dollars to clean up whatever the problem was. And it's very easy to figure out a business case for GRC if you just use 5 incidents to, come up with like an average price of problems that you could have if you don't have a good risk management program. And lastly, the CEO had to step down a few months later. So, what I noticed out of this was, I would have expected that Sony would have had some kind of analysis of what are the key risks that they are concerned about. And I would have thought that they would have a top risk being a cybersecurity incident. And I would have thought that they would have a list of what is the sensitive information that we need to protect. Intellectual property like movies, client information, or personal information about our employees. And then I would have thought that they would have had a crisis response plan that if any of this sensitive data is leaked, or either they would have some kind of preventive control, or they would have had a detective control to figure out that this had happened, and then they would have had this response plan, and that they would have practiced it once a year. It didn't appear that they had any of those things from looking at this incident. So this is basically another example of something of a scenario analysis that I've used at different points when I'm discussing the value of risk management with senior management or trying to implement an incident response plan, for example. I'm going to skip over this case study in the interest of time and just sort of summarize a few discussion points here. So just sort of repeating what I said before, companies must manage different types of risks at different points in their growth. So that's the key thing about enterprise risk, is really thinking about all different risk types. Snap is an example of a company that just really faced financial risks. Now that it's public, its risk will likely evolve. Uber is an example of a company that faces significant legal risk, faces now kind of product risk also with this autonomous vehicle accident. And then I had an example of an insurance company, but any large company really faces much more operational risk and regulatory risk, and they need to have processes and controls in place for making sure that they have controls in place or risk management in place for those kinds of risks. This is a very simple summary model of an enterprise risk framework that is how I think about enterprise risk management. And a company of any size can start from the top, which is what is the list of our top risks, and review it with senior management and the board semi-annually, and at least once a year, do a very thorough deep dive. Let's sit back and make sure that we have our list of top risks. Then, as your risk management program evolves and becomes more mature, you can go to the next step. You could define risk appetite statements for your top risks and thresholds for each of your risk appetite statements related back to your top risks. And finally, if you are very mature, then you have all the other things that go under that. The risk taxonomy, the key risk indicators, detailed reporting, and the GRC tools. So all those things, I mean, pretty much everything on this page, there were lots of really good sessions throughout the last day and a half on. So I'm hoping that you all got exposed to, many of these case studies from other people here who've been talking about how to do these things. But I would say this is basically what enterprise risk management framework is. I'm not really going to go through all these lessons learned and takeaways, but I would say there's 2 points in here. The first one, which is that fragmented data can severely affect any company of any size, especially listed. And if you're not able to capture risk information in a very short period of time, like if it takes you weeks to do your risk reporting to the board, then if there is a crisis or there is a market shock, how are you going to produce that information in hours that the board is going to ask for that information? Which leads me to the last takeaway, which is make sure that the board is sufficiently independent, that the board is willing to challenge management. That wasn't happening at Uber for a very long time. It took a while for Uber to gain a board that actually was challenging management. And also what's common in many companies is that the board, and this could have been the problem at Sony, that the board doesn't have the skill set to actually understand the risks that the company is facing. I mean, I've heard this over and over in many places that the board needs training on how to understand and discuss cyber risks. So, that is basically the last slide. And I have a list of material that I looked at in the appendix, and the presentation will be available for everybody. So I'm going to pause here and take questions. Stunned silence. Oh boy. My friendly internal auditor from Wells Fargo.
There you go. So Annu, you talked about the different stages companies are going through, and I imagine it's difficult, and a lot of people are facing CEOs or executive leaders that perhaps have not matured in their thinking about the size company that they're dealing with, and may not be ready to invest in mitigating some of the new risks that are out there or on the horizon. Any tips on how to speak with either boards or leaders of an organization as they're going through that maturation?
So, so I have worked in 4 companies in risk management. And I find that what makes board and management super alert is when a problem happens. It's nicer if the problem happens somewhere else. So when the Sony problem happened, I was working at a small hedge fund, and in January of that year, I used the Sony example to do scenario analysis with the Operational Risk Committee. And they got really engaged in it because, of course, there was the comedy factor of the movie about Kim Jong-un and all this stuff. Everybody knows Sony, everybody goes to the movies. But the point I'm trying to make is that board and senior management will understand risks if you bring it home to them in their terms. So, in that situation, back in 2014 or whenever that Sony incident happened, I kind of related back the intellectual property issue of, losing a movie that you had invested millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars in time on, to the Operational Risk Committee at the company I was at, and who was very concerned about their intellectual property, which was trading models. The other thing that you could correlate, that I did to correlate from that, was think about the emails that were leaked with the Sony Pictures Entertainment CEO talking in derogatory terms about movie stars, who they really need to have to work for them so that they could actually have a company so that they, to sell movies with these movie stars. So, all these things can be related back to whatever your business is, whatever your product is, and whatever your strategic goals are. And I have found issues that happen in the environment to be a really good way to spring off and talk to the board. Wow. Only one friendly internal audit question.
Hi, thank you very much for this presentation and for me personally, I work for an investment company across the different phases that you did mention.
Okay.
What we've seen is the pace at which companies go through this, as you gave the example of Snap,
Yeah.
which has lost half its value since they listed.
I did notice that this morning. I was trying to check what its price was and stuff. But hey, I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's got nothing to do with GRC, but probably high valuation. But the point is, do you think that companies that are digital today are able to keep up the development like traditional companies? For example, a manufacturing company would have taken 40 years to get to that stage.
Yeah.
These companies are getting to 2, 3, 5 years. Do you think that their risk management processes are as robust? Because I presume it's not going to be robust as a manufacturing or a financial services company.
One would think so, but I mean, I've met people here from manufacturing companies who are saying that their risk programs need a lot of renovation. So it conceptually feels like, these startups in 5 years, what kind of risk management could they have actually put in place? And they probably don't have nice dashboards, and they probably wouldn't know what a risk appetite statement is if it hit them in the face. But they are doing informal risk management so that they can actually have a company, have employees that are not, unhappy, and happy customers. So there's a lot of things that startups do informally that I think help them to stay in business and get to IPO. And yeah, Snap might have gone to half of its valuation, but maybe it was super overpriced in the first place.
How do you reconcile the often differing objectives of management of a startup versus the investors in terms of hedge funds and all that, who really just want to get into the IPO, make the big bucks, and step away in terms of GRC? So their risk appetites may differ. So how do you reconcile the two, management and investors?
I think investors, in whether or not you're talking about a listed company or a pre-IPO company, because Uber could stay and have private investors for the rest of its life. It doesn't really matter whether they are listed or not. Every investor really wants one thing, is for the company to make money and stay in business. And if you don't, I think their expectations are in sync. I don't think they are in conflict. The investor wants return on investment, of course, but they don't want it at the cost of company doing horrible things that will take it down. So, the idea is enterprise risk should not, people have this sense that when they look at credit risk, market risk, and so on, they're very sort of fixed disciplines with regulations, rules, methodology, how to measure things. Same thing with operational risk. Enterprise risk is a little bit more sort of flexible in the sense you have almost, even if you're not going through all these phases of company maturity that I spoke about, the idea is really each year to look across all risk type spectrum and all your business areas and all the geographies that you're in and say, what are our top risks? And 1 year it could be all about your financial risks, and the next year it could be all about your product risk. So I think that's the key point about an enterprise risk framework, is that it's not fixed. The discipline is not about people who know everything about how to count or rank or report one type of risk types. It's really about the ability to look across multiple risk types. I don't know if I answered your question.
All right, well, thank you, Annu. Appreciate it. There's no more questions. We'll close session. I think George had a couple of remarks, or okay. Oh, okay. All right. Thanks, Annu.